The lights of the CNN studio bore down on the debate stage where Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood facing legendary Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz. The tension in the room was palpable as cameras zoomed in on Crockett's face, her eyes focused with laser-like intensity. Just moments earlier, Dershowitz had finished a lengthy defense of presidential immunity, his voice confident and dismissive as he lectured the audience about constitutional law. "No one," he declared with finality, "can question my consistent interpretation of executive privilege throughout my 50-year career." That's when Crockett leaned forward, microphone in hand, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The former public defender and civil rights attorney wasn't intimidated by Dershowitz's credentials or reputation. She waited for perfect silence before asking a single, devastating question that made Dershowitz freeze mid-gesture. The color drained from the famous attorney's face. For perhaps the first time in his decades-long career, Alan Dershowitz was speechless, mouth opening and closing without producing words. The audience gasped, then erupted in murmurs as the camera caught his stunned expression in real time. This wasn't just a debate point, it was a career-defining moment that would explode across social media within minutes. Before diving into this remarkable confrontation, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss our latest political analysis and dramatic showdown. Alan Dershowitz sat comfortably in his chair on the CNN set, his familiar silver hair and glasses giving him the appearance of the distinguished academic he was. At 85, the Harvard law professor emeritus carried the confidence of someone who had argued before the Supreme Court numerous times and represented high-profile clients from O.J. Simpson to Donald Trump. The cameras highlighted his expensive suit and the authoritative way he gestured when making points. "I've defended constitutional principles consistently for over 5 decades, Dershowitz proclaimed, addressing the moderator with the ease of someone who had been on television hundreds of times. "My position on presidential powers has never changed, regardless of who sits in the Oval Office." The CNN special debate, titled "Presidential Powers: The Constitutional Crisis," had been promoted heavily for weeks. With recent Supreme Court decisions and ongoing disputes about executive privilege, the stakes couldn't be higher. The American public was divided, and this debate promised to clarify the complex legal issues at play. Across from Dershowitz sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, representing Texas's 30th congressional district. At 42, the first-term representative was relatively new to national politics, but brought impressive credentials as a former criminal defense attorney and civil rights lawyer. Her meteoric rise from the Texas House of Representatives to Congress had caught national attention, as had her sharp questioning in committee hearings that regularly went viral. Crockett's deep blue suit stood out against the studio backdrop, her expression calm but determined. Unlike Dershowitz, who had decades in the public spotlight, Crockett represented a new generation of leadership, unapologetic, meticulous in preparation, and unwilling to be talked down to by established figures. "Congresswoman Crockett, you've been a vocal critic of expanding presidential powers," the moderator said, turning to her. "What's your fundamental concern?" Crockett adjusted her microphone, her voice clear and measured. "My concern is simple: equal justice under law." Those words are engraved on the Supreme Court building for a reason. No American should be above the law, whether they live in public housing or the White House. The audience applauded, but Dershowitz waved his hand dismissively. "That's a fine slogan, Congresswoman, but it demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional separation of powers. When you've practiced constitutional law as long as I have, you recognize that the presidency is unique." Crockett didn't flinch at his condescension. Instead, she smiled slightly, her eyes never leaving his face. The research team had spent weeks preparing her for this moment, compiling Dershowitz's statements over decades. She had studied his arguments like a prosecutor preparing for cross-examination, identifying the one contradiction that would unravel his entire position. As the segment went to commercial, viewers could feel that something unprecedented was about to happen. Backstage, CNN producers whispered about the unusual intensity between the participants. This wasn't just another political debate, it was a collision between old guard and new, between established authority and rising power. Neither the audience nor Dershowitz himself realized that Crockett had been setting a trap, one question that would expose the fundamental inconsistency at the heart of his arguments, a question he couldn't possibly answer without undermining his own credibility. When the broadcast resumed, the moderator turned to Dershowitz. "Professor, you've written extensively about presidential immunity. Could you clarify your position for our viewers?" Dershowitz sat forward, clearly comfortable with the question. "Gladly. The Constitution creates a unique role for the president as head of the executive branch. While no one is above the law, the president must have certain immunities to function effectively. I've maintained this position consistently throughout my career, regardless of whether a Democrat or Republican was president." Crockett raised her eyebrows slightly, but remained silent, watching. "The founders," Dershowitz continued, warming to his subject, "created a system where the remedy for presidential misconduct is impeachment, not criminal prosecution. This has been my consistent position for 50 years of constitutional scholarship." The moderator turned to Crockett. "Congresswoman, your response?" "Professor Dershowitz speaks about consistency," she began, her tone respectful but firm. "But I'd like to address some specific examples. During the Clinton impeachment, you argued that impeachment required high crimes that didn't necessarily have to be statutory violations. Yet during Trump's first impeachment, you reversed that position. How do you reconcile those contradictory stances?" The audience murmured as Dershowitz shifted in his seat. "That's a mischaracterization of my position," he replied, his tone becoming defensive. "During the Clinton impeachment, I was speaking as a constitutional scholar about the historical meaning of high crimes and misdemeanors. During the Trump impeachment, I was addressing whether specific allegations met that threshold." The camera caught Crockett's slight smile as she flipped open a folder. "I have your exact quotes here, Professor. In 1998, you said impeachment certainly doesn't have to be a crime if you have somebody who completely corrupts the office. In 2019, you stated the opposite, saying impeachment required criminal-like behavior. That seems like a direct contradiction." Dershowitz's face flushed slightly. "Context matters, Congresswoman. Those statements were addressing different legal questions." "Were they?" Crockett pressed. "Because it seems the only context that changed was the party of the president in question." The audience reacted with scattered applause. Dershowitz's expression hardened as he leaned toward his microphone. "I've spent my career defending constitutional principles regardless of partisan politics," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Unlike some politicians who change positions based on polling, my views are based on consistent interpretation of our founding document. The moderator, sensing the rising tension, attempted to redirect. "Let's focus specifically on the current Supreme Court case regarding presidential immunity," but Crockett wasn't finished. "With respect, I'd like to address the professor's claim about consistency." She turned back to Dershowitz. "In your 2004 book, Rights from Wrongs, you argued that no president should be immune from judicial scrutiny. Yet in 2020, you argued before the Senate that presidents have broad immunity for actions they believe are in the national interest. What changed?" Dershowitz's jaw tightened. "You're taking my arguments out of context, Congresswoman. In 2004, I was addressing specific actions outside the scope of presidential duties. In 2020, I was addressing official acts clearly within the constitutional authority of the presidency." The camera caught Crockett opening another folder. "So your position on presidential immunity depends on what you consider official acts?" "Of course," Dershowitz replied, visibly irritated. "That's basic constitutional law. Official acts carry different legal implications than personal acts. This isn't controversial among serious legal scholars." Crockett nodded slowly, letting his condescension hang in the air. "And who determines what constitutes an official act?" "Ultimately the courts," Dershowitz answered. "But there's substantial precedent guiding those determinations. Precedent you've argued both for and against, depending on the administration," Crockett noted. The studio grew tense. CNN producers watching from the control room could see this was no ordinary debate. Dershowitz, normally composed and pressiforial, was becoming increasingly agitated. Crockett, meanwhile, maintained a calm demeanor, methodically working through her points like an experienced trial attorney. The debate continued, touching on various aspects of executive power. With each exchange, Crockett brought receipts, direct quotes, video clips, and legal citations, while Dershowitz increasingly relied on appeals to his authority and experience. "Congressman," Dershowitz said, incorrectly addressing her, "with all due respect, I've argued before the Supreme Court 9 times. I've taught constitutional law at Harvard for 5 decades. These nuances might not be apparent to someone without that depth of experience." The audience reacted audibly to the patronizing tone. Crockett's expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "It's Congresswoman," she corrected calmly. "And I'm quite familiar with your credentials, Professor. I'm also familiar with the principle that when the facts are on your side, you pound the facts. When the law is on your side, you pound the law. And when neither is on your side..." She let the well-known legal adage hang unfinished in the air. "You pound the table." The audience erupted in a mixture of gasps and applause. The moderator, struggling to maintain control, announced they would take a final commercial break before the conclusion of the debate. As the cameras temporarily stopped rolling, Dershowitz leaned over to his aide, visibly frustrated. "She's playing to the crowd, not making legal arguments," he muttered, loud enough for nearby microphones to pick up. Crockett, meanwhile, calmly reviewed her notes. Her team had prepared her extensively for this moment, and everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The trap was set, and the final question, the one Dershowitz couldn't possibly answer without contradicting himself, was about to be sprung. As the program returned from commercial break, the moderator addressed both guests. "We're in our final segment. Professor Dershowitz, you've made strong claims about your consistency on constitutional interpretation. Congresswoman Crockett, you've challenged those claims. Let's give each of you a final opportunity to make your case." Dershowitz spoke first, his tone pressiforial but with an edge of irritation. "Throughout my career, I have been guided by constitutional principles, not partisan politics. Yes, legal positions evolve as our understanding deepens, but my core philosophy has remained constant. The presidency requires certain immunities to function effectively, regardless of who holds the office. What matters is protecting the institution, not the individual." He gestured emphatically. "The Congresswoman has selectively quoted my work out of context to suggest inconsistencies where none exist. This is a common tactic when substantive arguments fail. I stand by every position I've taken because each was grounded in constitutional principles applied to specific circumstances." The camera panned to Crockett, who nodded thoughtfully as Dershowitz spoke. When he finished, she thanked the moderator and turned slightly to face both Dershowitz and the audience. "Professor Dershowitz speaks eloquently about consistency and constitutional principles," she began, her voice calm but resonant. "But there's a fundamental question that needs answering." She paused, reaching for a document in front of her. The studio fell completely silent. "Professor, in your 1998 book, Sexual McCarthyism, you wrote, and I quote, 'If a president committed murder and claimed it was an official act because the victim posed a national security threat, no one would seriously argue that presidential immunity would protect him from prosecution.' You emphasized this point repeatedly in interviews during the Clinton administration." Crockett looked directly at Dershowitz. "Yet, in 2020, during President Trump's impeachment trial, you argued before the Senate that if a president believes his re-election is in the national interest, actions taken to secure that re-election cannot be impeachable. You specifically said if a president does something which he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment." The studio remained silent as Crockett continued. "So my question is simple, Professor. If a president believed that eliminating a political rival would help secure their re-election, and they believed their re-election was in the national interest, would that murder be an impeachable offense under your 2020 standard? And if yes, how do you reconcile that with your 1998 position?" The question hung in the air. The camera zoomed in on Dershowitz's face, capturing his momentary shock. His mouth opened, then closed. For perhaps the first time in his public career, the famous attorney seemed genuinely at a loss for words. Seconds ticked by. The audience remained completely silent. The moderator, equally stunned by the directness of the question, didn't interject. Finally, Dershowitz attempted to respond. That's a complete distortion of my position. Obviously, murder would be..." "I'm quoting your exact words, Professor," Crockett interjected calmly. "Your 1998 position explicitly said presidential murder wouldn't be protected. Your 2020 position stated that actions taken in pursuit of re-election, if believed to be in the national interest, cannot be impeachable. These positions appear directly contradictory. I'm simply asking which one represents your actual view." Dershowitz's face flushed red. "You're creating a false dichotomy, Congresswoman. No reasonable interpretation of my 2020 argument would include murder. But your argument didn't include any limiting principle." Crockett pressed, still calm. "You stated that actions taken to secure re-election, if believed to be in the national interest, cannot be impeachable. You didn't exclude any specific actions. So I'm asking you to clarify, where exactly is the line, and why did your position change so dramatically between 1998 and 2020? The studio remained silent as Dershowitz struggled visibly. The contexts were entirely different. The only context that changed was the president's party affiliation, Crockett said. The audience erupted in gasps and spontaneous applause. The camera caught Dershowitz's stunned expression as he realized he'd walked directly into her trap. It's a cheap shot, he sputtered, his composure cracking. "My record of defending civil liberties across party lines? Your record is precisely what I'm questioning," Crockett said. "Not your credentials or experience, but your consistency on this fundamental constitutional issue. Americans deserve to know whether your interpretation of presidential power depends on who holds the office." The moderator, recognizing the historic nature of the exchange, allowed it to continue without interruption. Dershowitz attempted to regain his footing. "Congresswoman, your question creates a hypothetical that distorts my actual position. I never suggested—" "It's not a hypothetical, Professor," Crockett interrupted, holding up the transcripts. "I'm asking you to reconcile your own documented statements. In 1998, you said presidential murder wouldn't be protected. In 2020, you said actions taken to secure re-election cannot be impeachable if the president believes they're in the national interest. These positions cannot both be true." The camera zoomed in on Dershowitz's face as he realized there was no escape from the contradiction. His reputation for constitutional consistency, the very foundation of his credibility, was crumbling on national television. I would need to review the full context of those statements," he finally said, his voice noticeably weaker. "I have the full transcripts right here," Crockett replied, patting the folder in front of her. "Would you like me to read more?" The audience erupted again. The CNN moderator, recognizing the moment would dominate news cycles for days, finally intervened. "We need to wrap up. Professor Dershowitz, a final response?" Dershowitz gathered himself, straightening his tie. "The Congresswoman is playing political games with complex legal positions. Anyone who has studied constitutional law understands that context matters. My positions have evolved based on deeper constitutional analysis, not partisan considerations." But his usual confidence was gone. Even to casual viewers, it was clear he hadn't answered the question. The moderator turned to Crockett. "Crockett's woman, your final thoughts?" Crockett nodded, looking directly into the camera. "The Constitution isn't a political weapon to be reinterpreted based on who's in power. Equal justice under law means exactly that, equal. When our most prominent legal minds apply different standards based on political affiliation, public trust in our institutions erodes. That's not a partisan observation, it's a concern every American should share." She turned back to Dershowitz. "Professor, I respect your decades of service and your contributions to legal scholarship, but on this fundamental question of presidential power, the American people deserve consistency, not constitutional interpretations that conveniently shift with the political winds." As the moderator wrapped up the segment, the damage was done. Alan Dershowitz, who had built his reputation on unwavering principle, had been exposed on national television as unable to reconcile his own contradictory positions. And Jasmine Crockett, armed with nothing but Dershowitz's own words, had accomplished what few had ever managed, rendering the famous Harvard professor speechless with a single unanswerable question. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, "Crockett destroys Dershowitz" began trending on Twitter. The clip of Dershowitz's stunned silence spread across social media platforms at lightning speed, with the 45-second moment when he couldn't answer Crockett's question being viewed millions of times within the first hour. Major news networks immediately began analyzing the exchange. On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow played the clip in its entirety, then remarked, "What we just witnessed was extraordinary." Congresswoman Crockett methodically exposed a fundamental contradiction in Professor Dershowitz's constitutional arguments that he simply couldn't reconcile. Even on Fox News, where Dershowitz had been a regular contributor, analysts struggled to defend his performance. Regardless of your political perspective, one commentator noted, the failure to address Congresswoman Crockett's central question is troubling for someone of Dershowitz's stature. The CNN studio was still buzzing with energy as Crockett gathered her notes. Staff members approached to congratulate her on what many were already calling a defining moment in recent political discourse. As she exited to the green room, her phone was flooded with notifications, text messages, social media alerts, and calls from other congressional leaders. "You just did what the entire legal community has been trying to do for years," one senior Democratic senator texted her. "You caught him in his own contradiction and he had nowhere to hide." Meanwhile, Dershowitz hurried from the studio, declining requests for follow-up interviews. His publicist issued a brief statement. Professor Dershowitz appreciates the opportunity to discuss important constitutional issues. Complex legal positions often require more nuance than television formats allow. He looks forward to addressing these topics in more appropriate scholarly venues. The statement only fueled more commentary, with legal analysts pointing out that Dershowitz had regularly used television to make bold, unnuanced claims about presidential power, only to retreat to claims about scholarly nuance when directly challenged. By the next morning, every major newspaper featured the confrontation. The New York Times ran the headline, "In Stunning Exchange, Crockett Challenges Dershowitz on Presidential Power Contradictions." The Washington Post went further. Dershowitz speechless, how Congresswoman Crockett exposed constitutional double standards. Law schools across the country began incorporating the exchange into their constitutional law discussions. Harvard law students, where Dershowitz had taught for decades, organized a symposium titled Constitutional Consistency, the Crockett Question. The political implications were equally significant. Crockett, already a rising star in progressive circles, was suddenly being mentioned as a potential future Senate candidate or even presidential material. Her methodical dismantling of one of America's most famous legal minds demonstrated an intellectual precision and strategic thinking that transcended typical political debate. What made this moment so powerful, explained a CNN political analyst, wasn't just that Congresswoman Crockett challenged Professor Dershowitz, it's that she used his own words to expose a fundamental inconsistency in positions he's taken over decades. She didn't attack him personally, she simply revealed a contradiction he couldn't resolve. 3 days after the debate, Dershowitz published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal attempting to explain his position. "Textual constitutional interpretation is not inconsistency," the headline read. But the damage was done. The comments section filled with variations of Crockett's unanswered question, and legal blogs meticulously dismantled his attempts at reconciliation. A week later, CNN announced that the segment had become their most viewed clip of the year, with over 15 million views across platforms. The phrase "pulling a Crockett" entered the political lexicon, referring to the technique of trapping an opponent with their own contradictory statements. For Crockett herself, the aftermath brought new opportunities and challenges. Interview requests poured in from major networks. The Democratic leadership invited her to play a more prominent role in constitutional discussions. Her donor base expanded exponentially, with small-dollar contributions flowing in from Americans impressed by her performance. "What we saw wasn't just a political victory," noted a prominent constitutional scholar. "It was a reminder that accountability matters. When public figures take contradictory positions based on partisan considerations rather than principle, they should be called to account, exactly as Congresswoman Crockett did." Perhaps most significantly, the exchange shifted the national conversation about presidential power. Legal analysts who had previously accepted shifting standards based on political affiliation found themselves facing harder questions about consistency. News anchors began challenging guests to reconcile their current positions with past statements, a practice dubbed the Crockett test. 2 weeks after the debate, Crockett appeared on 60 Minutes to discuss the aftermath. When asked if she had anticipated Dershowitz's inability to answer her question, she smiled. "I wasn't trying to embarrass Professor Dershowitz," she explained. "I was trying to highlight a serious issue in our constitutional discourse. When legal interpretations change based on who's in power rather than on principle, we undermine the rule of law itself. That's not a partisan concern, it's an American one." The interviewer pressed her, "But did you know he wouldn't have an answer?" Crockett considered the question carefully. "I knew he didn't have a consistent answer. The contradiction between his 1998 position and his 2020 position is irreconcilable. What surprised me wasn't that he couldn't answer, it was that in all his media appearances, no one had ever directly asked him to reconcile those specific statements. As the interview concluded, the 60 Minutes correspondent noted that Professor Dershowitz had declined their invitation to appear. His spokesperson said, "He's working on a new book addressing these constitutional questions in depth," the correspondent explained. Crockett nodded. "I look forward to reading it. Constitutional principles shouldn't change based on who's in the White House. That was true in 1998, it was true in 2020, and it remains true today." The moment had transcended a single debate or political scoring point. It had become a reference point in discussions about constitutional interpretation and intellectual consistency, a reminder that even the most prominent legal minds should be held accountable for contradictions in their fundamental positions. For Jasmine Crockett, it marked a transition from promising newcomer to national voice on constitutional matters. For Alan Dershowitz, it represented a rare public reckoning with decades of shifting positions. And for the American public, it provided a rare moment of clarity in an often murky constitutional debate. 6 months later, when a new Supreme Court case on presidential immunity emerged, reporters immediately asked both legal experts and politicians, "Would your position on this case change if the president were of a different party?" The question became known as the Crockett Standard, a simple but powerful test of constitutional consistency. The debate that began with a single unanswerable question had evolved into something larger, a national conversation about consistency, principle, and the true meaning of equal justice under law. If you found this analysis of this historic confrontation valuable, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We break down the most significant political and constitutional moments, going beyond the sound bites to examine what really matters. Leave a comment with your thoughts on this remarkable exchange between Congresswoman Crockett and Professor Dershowitz. We'd love to hear your perspective.